and had a wonderful teacher by the name of Sonia Daniels. She since left, of course, in pursuit of greener pastures. And in geography, we learned about the trade winds. We learned that the trade winds blew from the southeast and that they played a very important role in cooling the Earth's temperature around the equator. But these winds also, Mr. Speaker, brought tropical storms, and they brought the hurricanes that wrought serious damage across our region. These were the trades that the winds that facilitated early trade and commerce, but these were also the winds that brought the transatlantic slave trade, which the UN has called one of the greatest crimes against humanity that we've ever known. I guess my point is, Mr. Speaker, trade winds serve both good and a bad purpose. And when I cast my mind to our country, I am reminded of the song sung by one of my favorite singers, Lou Rawls, when he spoke about being caught in the trade winds of our times. And it occurs to me that Guyana is a nation that is indeed caught in the trade wind of our times, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on our shores, strong geopolitical currents are converging, forces that are beyond our borders, and they're shifting in ways that we are not able to anticipate. From the rising influence of global superpowers to the realignment of regional alliances, the winds are changing and the stakes are high. We are positioned at a crossroad, Mr. Speaker, where strategic partnerships and economic opportunities collide, but so do the risks of exploitation and manipulation. In this time of geopolitical flux, it is important that we remain vigilant, that we discern the motivations of foreign interests while we safeguard our sovereignty and ensure that the benefits of our global engagement reaches to every Guyanese citizen. Mr. Speaker, our foreign policy serves as the rudder of our national ship. And just as the rudder is a small yet critical part of the ship, foreign policy, though often understated, is critical to the development of foreign policy and to the development of our nation. Mr. Speaker, it is what shapes our position on the global stage and is what safeguards the future of our people. So, Mr. Speaker, when the Honorable Minister came to this House, the Honorable Foreign Affairs Minister, when he came to this House and said that when the PPPC took office in 2020, and I quote, they did not inherit a foreign policy from the AP and UAFC, we all know, Mr. Speaker, that it is patently untrue. Mr. Speaker, but you know what? They want to draw us into this backward-looking game. But we're not going to be like them and be drawn into the backward-looking game. Mr. Speaker, we will not move backwards. Instead, Mr. Speaker, what we had hoped that the Honorable Minister would come to tell this House is, since they have been in office for the last 53 months, and they're now requesting funding somewhere close to $10 billion, Mr. Speaker, what we expected the honorable member to tell this House is how the proposed PPPC foreign policy has evolved. Mr. Speaker, he has failed in his address to say anything to this House about how their foreign policy has evolved. And I'm going to choose, Mr. Speaker, just 3 areas in the interest of time to show just how irresponsible this PPPC administration has been in the stewardship of Guyana's foreign policy. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about migration. Mr. Speaker, we know that the issue of migration is one of the single most troublesome issues for the Guyanese out there. You go into the street and you ask them. They are concerned, Mr. Speaker, about the unchecked migration into our country. They are concerned, Mr. Speaker, about this phenomenon. And Mr. Speaker, the minister of Home Affairs, who is responsible for immigration, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who should be playing a leading role in the development of a migration policy, came to this House and uttered nary a word on this pressing issue. Mr. Speaker, it is crucial that we address the issues and the challenges posed by our porous borders, because these continue to expose us to significant risks and undermine our national security and our territorial integrity. Mr. Speaker, the Minister with responsibility for immigration, the Honorable Minister Ben, is quoted in the Stabroek News of January 20th, 2025, as saying that it is anticipated that the migrant population in Guyana will increase. But they have not laid out a roadmap to address this issue. Mr. Speaker, to date, the government is unable to provide a realistic estimate of the number of particularly Venezuelan migrants in our country. And the reason is clear, Mr. Speaker. It is because they do not know. Mr. Speaker, it is obvious, painfully obvious, from the fact that the members had nothing to offer us as to how they will manage migration into this country, that they have lost control of the migrant situation. And they have put our country, Mr. Speaker, resultingly in clear and present danger, jeopardizing our security and our sovereignty. Mr. Speaker, to mitigate these risks and to protect the integrity of our nation, we must immediately, Mr. Speaker, immediately establish a mandatory migrant registration system. Mr. Speaker, this system will allow us to effectively monitor the movement of individuals entering our country, to track the duration of their stay, and to ensure that migration, particularly across our porous borders, particularly, Mr. Speaker, across our porous borders, that they are monitored, Mr. Speaker, and to ensure that the migration is done in a more orderly fashion. Mr. Speaker, it will enable us to prevent illegal entries and track potential threats, including foreign agents and fifth columnists. And you know, when we say this, the PPPC government likes to say that we are invoking fear in the people of Guyana, but no less a person than their national security advisor is on record as expressing the concern that we do not know who we are letting into the country, that there are military men of age in our country, and we have no way of tracking them and no way of knowing their whereabouts. This is not what we have said. This is what their national security advisor has said. Mr. Speaker, further, refugees and migrants must only be granted temporary status until they can return to their homelands with a clear and explicit provision against voting rights. I repeat, with a clear and explicit provision against voting rights. Guyanese citizenship must remain a privilege and not a pathway to manipulation or long-term instability. Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable that the migration profile that the Honorable Member Todd launched in December of 2021 is to date incomplete. And he comes here and he does not offer any explanation to us for this untenable state of affairs. Mr. Speaker,
That is incomplete.
a migration profile is the cornerstone. It is the foundation upon which we will build a sound migration policy. Why are we harping on this, Mr. Speaker? Why is it that it is so important that we have a migration policy? Mr. Speaker, it was the Argentine diplomat, Juan Bautista Alberdi, who coined a particular phrase. He said, to govern is to populate. To govern is to populate. Mr. Speaker, and we as a nation have to be mindful that this paradigm is not being used against us to our detriment by the deliberate injection of population into our Essequibo. Mr. Speaker, we must place emphasis on enhancing our military presence along the border, much like the coalition did with Operation Armadillo. Instead of having our military men and women in blue t-shirts cleaning the drains in the city. Mr. Speaker, We must address our minds to increasing government-led investment in the Essequibo, Mr. Speaker, to incentivize the settlement of Guyanese in that region, even as we combat the effects of climate change, etc., along our low coastal plain. Mr. Speaker, we in the coalition have a vision for the development of the Essequibo. It is not by accident, sir, that the townships of Bartica, of Letem, of Mabaruma, and Madhya were established between 2015 and 2018. We just didn't wake up one day and decided we were going to do it. It was a part of a deliberate strategy to ensure that we establish, Mr. Speaker,
We didn't just wake up.
economic and administrative hubs for the development and the population of the Essequibo, Mr. Speaker. This is what national development requires. Carefully thought out plans, carefully thought out policies, and the capacity to implement and to execute. Mr. Speaker,
You can't break dance, you got to think.
when you travel the length and breadth of this nation, like I said before, the people are concerned about the abysmal handling by this government of the migration crisis. There's no policy in place, Mr. Speaker, and they intend to put none in place. But you know, we are in the age of abbreviation and mnemonics, and I'm tempted to say that this is the PPPC postponing practical policy continuously, Mr. Speaker, and placing people's concerns. That is who they are, Mr. Speaker. We on this side of the House will implement a Guyana and Guyanese first migration policy. I repeat, we will implement a Guyana and Guyanese first migration policy because our policy will put the needs and interests of Guyanese first, unapologetically, while we responsibly manage migration to benefit national development, including the supply of labor, and while we emphasize protecting our local opportunities, preserving our cultural identity, and ensuring sustainable growth. Mr. Speaker, directly related to the ongoing Venezuela, to this ongoing migration issue, is this issue of the Guyana-Venezuela controversy. Mr. Speaker, we in the parliamentary opposition have been unequivocal in our condemnation of the recent actions by the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which include, Mr. Speaker, the completion of a bridge to Ankoko Island and the announcement of plans to elect a governor to administer the Essequibo region. Mr. Speaker, these actions constitute a dangerous escalation of aggression that cannot go unchallenged. We must now move, Mr. Speaker, beyond the lodging of formal protests to more proactive and decisive action. We on this side of the House are on record as making a number of recommendations to the PPPC administration, including the full mobilization of our diplomatic apparatus to secure continued international support, and that apparatus would emphasize the justness and the rightness of our cause. We continue to stress the importance of a robust international public relations campaign, and of course the engagement of the Guyanese diaspora in advocating for our sovereignty. Mr. Speaker, we have called for the establishment of a Border Security Commission and the establishment of a Foreign Relations Council. Our calls, Mr. Speaker, including calls to the convening of regular meetings of the Foreign Relations Sectoral Committee, continue to fall on deaf ears. Mr. Speaker, despite the Minister of Foreign Affairs having the temerity to stand in this House and to say they did not inherit any foreign policy from the APNUFC coalition, we see foreign policy in action, Mr. Speaker, because it is a fact, sir, that it is under the David Granger-led administration that this Guyana-Venezuela controversy was elevated to the ICJ with the full concurrence of the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, the one diplomatic endeavor that this government engaged in this regard, the Argyle Declaration, turned out to be a disaster, with an entire government being duped, Mr. Speaker, And Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, you heard Mr. McCoy.
Mr. Speaker, may I continue?
Alien for me.
I was saying, Mr. Speaker, I was reiterating the fact that the Argyle Declaration turned out to be a colossal diplomatic failure. And you know what? I expect that the honorable members are going to come to say, oh, you know, on this issue we must stand united. But I will say to them, if you come to this house and you tell the truth, we will support you. But if you don't, we will answer you accordingly. And as we are on failures, Mr. Speaker, the ban on catfish is still yet to be lifted. Mr. Speaker, Guyanese fisher folk, honorable member, are still waiting on the 150 SC license from Suriname. Failure upon failure upon failure, Mr. Speaker. But this is the PPPC. They parade as if they know policy, but they're proven clueless. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk to us about CARICOM. I want to talk to us about CARICOM in relation to this, because the silence of CARICOM in this regard has been deafening. Mr. Speaker, the silence is not just deafening, it is disappointing. It is dangerous. It sends the wrong signal, not only to Venezuela, but to the world, that aggression could be met with apathy. Mr. Speaker, traditionally, CARICOM has been our first line of defense, and that line simply is not holding. Mr. Speaker, after much fanfare about the now obviously dead Argyle Declaration, the voices of key CARICOM leaders are deafeningly silent, Mr. Speaker. But I am sure that we will hear from them again at elections time. But they appear muted now in the face of Venezuela's ongoing aggression. Mr. Speaker, I want to be clear. CARICOM's inaction undermines its credibility, and it fails to uphold its collective commitment, Mr. Speaker, to upholding the sovereignty of its member states. The Essequibo is not just a Guyanese issue, it's a CARICOM issue. And Mr. Speaker, it is time that CARICOM step up, that they speak out, and that they demonstrate that they will not tolerate the violation of our sovereignty and our territorial integrity. Anything less is an abdication of their responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I want to talk to us about our diplomatic representation, because key to our foreign policy thrust is our diplomatic representation overseas. The honorable member should have been able to tell this House how he and his government will ensure that Guyana is represented by a professional cadre of diplomats. He should have been able to tell this House what plans are in place to appoint younger career diplomats in our embassies in Brasilia, Caracas, Paramaribo, Mr. Speaker, and Washington. I repeat, you should be able to tell us what plans are in place to appoint younger career diplomats to these posts that I have called. Mr. Speaker, I am by no means ageist, but Mr. Speaker, we must have a plan to ensure continuity and competence. Mr. Speaker, Guyana remains seriously underrepresented in Africa, with one diplomatic mission in South Africa. Mr. Speaker, by comparison, Venezuela has 20. By comparison, Mr. Speaker, I heard the ministers boast, Mr. Speaker, that this year Guyana will be hosting a retreat of the African group. Well, I expect that for this $10 billion that we're giving him this year, that we will have an announcement of cooperation agreements, that we will hear about the establishment of more embassies and missions in Africa, and that they will be honest, Mr. Speaker, with the Africans about the number of Nigerian and other African students who have a difficulty getting visas on arrival here and who they refuse to renew their work permits, Mr. Speaker, because we are going to be here and we will let them know. Mr. Speaker, Minister Todd must tell us how much of this $10 billion he has put into the Foreign Services Institute, Mr. Speaker. And I apologize to the people of Guyana that I have to shout, but my colleague on the other side has descended this August house into a fish market, Mr. Speaker. But I want Mr. Todd to know you can't outshout me, you can't intimidate me, and I will speak and you will listen. Mr. Speaker, he must tell us how much of this $10 billion that he wants will be going to the Foreign Services Institute to train young diplomats, and what arrangements has he put in place to mentor the next generation of diplomats. I suspect, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that he has very little money put aside for that, because you know why? Traditionally, this PPPC government has always been about jobs for their cronies. Diplomatic postings have always been reward for favors granted. Mr. Speaker, it has always been jobs for the boys. Mr. Speaker, this is the classic PPPC when it comes to representing our country. Mr. Speaker, I could say that they are placing patrons in prestigious capitals. Mr. Speaker, I could say that they are only promising posts to party connections. That is the name and nature of the PPPC. Mr. Speaker, the foreign policy failure of the PPPC administration leaves us more vulnerable than we ever have been before. And Mr. Speaker, I will say this. They have left us more vulnerable than ever before to these raging foreign policy winds, Mr. Speaker, these raging geopolitical winds. Mr. Speaker, the PPPC believes, Mr. Speaker, that diplomacy looks a certain way. But I want them to understand that diplomacy is more than 2-minute calls between heads of state. It is more than convenient photo ops and the reveling in feel-good photo ops. It is more than that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I stood in this spot last year, Mr. Speaker, and I outlined 5 developmental priorities for our foreign relations. Mr. Speaker, he took none of them on board. I will once again ask, in the interest of the people of Guyana, and in the interest of time, because time is of the essence, that the honorable member take those 5 urgent priorities and begin to implement them in the short time that he has left. We will continue it when we assume office. Mr. Speaker, I will now move to my general comments on the budget. I believe that I've given the foreign minister enough homework for today. And I will now move to making some general comments on this 2025 budget. You know, when I read the budget, Mr. Speaker, I was like, here we go again. My first thought, here we go again. Budgeting more than we need, spending more than we have, shortchanging the next generation by raiding the NRF. Mr. Speaker, here we are again, not managing the efficiency gap, not developing our capacity to execute projects. It's the same old story, Mr. Speaker. Not learning from the lessons of states who have gone before us. Not intent on helping our people and this nation avoid the Dutch disease. I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker. We are always happy when the people of Guyana
receive increases in the old age pension. We are always happy when they receive increases in public assistance and disability allowances and education cash grants. But let us be clear, Mr. Speaker, those handouts tackle the symptoms of the problem and not the problem itself. Mr. Speaker, reducing poverty will require long-term structural economic reforms, and it is hard work that the PPP refuses to do. Mr. Speaker, the government comes to this National Assembly and they tell us year after year about the astronomical sums they have expended. Mr. Speaker, yet let's ask the Guyanese public, how has your life improved? Let's look at the sectors, Mr. Speaker. Let's look at health. Billions upon billions of dollars expended, yet we still have no Panadol in the local clinics, yet we still have 2 expectant mothers sharing beds, yet we still have rats, roaches, snakes, caiman infesting our hospitals. You wonder if it's a hospital or if it's being converted into a zoo. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about education. We spend billions and billions on education, yet when you check the stats, we still have one of the lowest literacy rates, Mr. Speaker, and our performances in maths and English continue to decline. Mr. Speaker, they boast about spending billions on school feeding programs, but the numbers are showing that malnourished children, the numbers are increasing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let us talk about water. It is no secret that the supply of water has degenerated, both in terms of supply and in quality. You only have to go on social media to see the graphics and the videos of people that stink water, the organic material coming out of the yard, out of their taps in their yards. And then perhaps the biggest admission of failure on it, a certain minister is in the media handing out black tanks because the water coming, but it's not going in.
Yes. That is what I mean. Water coming, but not going in.
The water coming, but it's not going in. Mr. Speaker, let us look at electricity. 2 power ships, 17 generators from Honduras later, 1 stalled gas to energy project, and more than $100 billion later, and Guyanese still have blackouts every day. And based on the fact that the Honorable Ashni Kumar Singh stood in this house and told us that he's taking VAT off of generators, it means that we could expect more blackouts. Let's talk about these billions, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about agriculture. My dear friend Zulfi, honorable member, over $300 billion expended, but yet the studies are showing that over 40% of Guyanese are still food insecure. And we have he who will not be named that parades himself as the champion of food security in the region. We keep saying you gotta dance a yard before you dance abroad. Ensure that your people are first food secure. And then you could worry about everybody else. But Mr. Speaker, something is wrong. Something is wrong, Mr. Speaker. When a government comes to this house and tells us that they're spending more money every year, and yet year after year, the lives of Guyanese are getting harder. Mr. Speaker, how can a country that is earning $7.6 million US per day, $7.6 million US per day, Mr. Speaker, and yet our children are going to bed hungry. Yet parents have to think about how they're going to make ends meet. Yet, Mr. Speaker, the capital city is filthy. Our roads are chaotic. We cannot get a full day of electricity supply without blackouts plaguing us. Our health centers lack the most basic drugs and medical equipment. Mr. Speaker, something is wrong. And you know, Mr. Speaker, I heard my colleagues on the other side making a big to-do about peace and prosperity and progress and commitment, Mr. Speaker, when the truth is that the only people who are progressing are the friends, family, and favorites of the PPC. The only peace that the people of Guyana know, Mr. Speaker, is the peace that passes all understanding that they get from on high, and certainly not from Robeson Ben, Honorable Member, and the police force that is in shambles, Mr. Speaker, when the only things that are prospering is the weapons of incompetence and mismanagement that this PPPC government continues to form against the people of Guyana. And when the only commitment that they have is to pilfering the patrimony of our people continuously. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Member Rodriguez challenged us to say, what project should we cut? Mr. Speaker, any member of the public who follows the news will hear the announcement of all kinds of projects coming out of Freedom House on a Thursday. So, Honorable Member, how about we don't right now build, Mr. Speaker, a second bridge over the Berbice River when the first one is not even operating at half of its capacity. Mr. Speaker, how about we hold off another airport terminal when, Mr. Speaker, we have not yet completed this one and we have not yet exceeded its capacity? How about, Mr. Speaker, we nix this second gas to energy project that the Vice President seems very gung-ho about, and we make sure that we get the first one right first? Mr. Speaker, how about we stop pouring concrete into every median on every public road that we could find, Mr. Speaker, when in any developing country, with any government, with any type of foresight, knows that properly landscaped medians help in flood control, they help in controlling noise pollution, and they help in reducing, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable Member, I allowed you to go 3 minutes more because I didn't want to interrupt. Honorable Member, Mr. Mahipon?
No, Ms.
Honorable Member,
Ferguson.
Ms. Ferguson?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would like for my colleague to be given 5 minutes more to conclude her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Honorable Member, you have 5 minutes to conclude.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you. So, Mr. Speaker, I want the Honorable Minister Rodriguez to tell us, how about we nix these things? And then I can't leave out my friend, the Honorable Attorney General, who says to us, Mr. Speaker, that you only need feasibility studies when let me quote him correctly, that feasibility studies are not needed when something appears obviously feasible. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Attorney General should know that's the approach you take when you're doing a project in your backyard. This is not your backyard. This is the nation of Guyana, and we require that projects have feasibility studies, Mr. Speaker. But in keeping with the mnemonics, Mr. Speaker, this is the PPPC. Poorly planned projects continuously. Mr. Speaker, there's so much to say, but I will close by speaking to the people of Guyana. Because I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker, the government, any government has a duty to provide infrastructure for its people. We must provide housing, we must provide roads for them to travel on, we must provide hospital and clinics, we must provide schools, Mr. Speaker, we must provide water, and we must provide electricity. It is the duty of government, Mr. Speaker, and Guyanese should not have to beg for any of those things. It is our right, Mr. Speaker. For far too long, Guyanese have been trapped in a game of survival that demands that demands that they trade their dignity for survival. Mr. Speaker, it is a game where venality thrives, where incompetence is rewarded over competence, and where untruthfulness is the currency of power. Mr. Speaker, it is a game of winner-take-all politics, where power is hoarded and power hoards resources. They entrench division and they exploit their provisions and connections, whilst the other citizens must struggle to make ends meet. Mr. Speaker, it is a game where nepotism, brain drain, and distraction politics have become the norm, and they are now forcing citizens to turn a blind eye to injustice and to excesses just so that they could survive. Mr. Speaker, in the end, it is up to us as a nation and as a people to decide and to look at ourselves and to ask ourselves whether we want meaningful change. Do we want change, or do we just want our turn? Those are the questions that we have to ask ourselves as Guyanese, Mr. Speaker. Do we dare to dismantle this broken system, or are we content to replace it with a different set of beneficiaries? Mr. Speaker, do we strive to build a nation that prioritizes equity, transparency, and inclusion, or do we perpetuate a cycle of exclusion and division? Mr. Speaker, this is not about just ending the game. It is about rewriting this game and restoring dignity. You know, one of my favorite artists, Drake, said something. He said the game needs change and we must be the cashiers. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I will say we must make constitutional reform a top priority if we are going to change this broken game to one of fairness, integrity, and hope. Mr. Speaker, we must build a nation where competence is rewarded, where, Mr. Speaker, nepotism and venality are no longer tolerated. And we must build it into a game of inclusivity, where every citizen, Mr. Speaker, regardless of class, race, political affiliation, or gender, feels empowered to thrive. Mr. Speaker, this new game must champion innovation and it must invest in our people, especially our youth, sir, to prevent the brain drain, Mr. Speaker, and inspire those who are abroad to return home. Mr. Speaker, it must foster leadership that serves rather than exploits. It must prioritize national unity over division and truth over propaganda, Mr. Speaker. Finally, I will say that ultimately, we must transform this game into a covenant, one built on trust, one built on accountability, and one that is built on a shared vision for Guyana, where our dignity is restored, where we don't have to be sycophants to thrive, and where a brighter future is not just a dream. And that is what we are committed to on this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, because we understand, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with the demonics of the day, we understand that people need care. We understand that our communities, Mr. Speaker, we understand that we must protect our nation's communities. We understand, Mr. Speaker, that we must build a Guyana for all Guyanese, not for some. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, in spite of the hard work of the members of staff at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I cannot lend my support to this budget in its current iteration. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very, very much, Honorable Member. Now for the Honorable Minister.